In 1869, in New York, a ledger inside the asylum recorded a girl of 14. The page called her an intake. The language was meant to be temporary, as if she were a case that would pass through the system like so many others. Yet what began as an admission line became her only biography. The file remained open, the entry never revised, while the girl stayed in one cell for 40 years. A contradiction was already inked on the page. The first column labeled her, "Child Admitted." But the walls did not admit her at all. They enclosed her, kept her, forgot to release her. A category that should have implied transition hardened into permanence. The ledger promised motion. The corridor allowed none. The paradox is cruel in its simplicity. A system that defines a person as moving, then traps them forever still. That stillness is not neutral. For decades, she lived in a single room no larger than 6 paces wide. The record never changed, but the seasons outside did. Snow on the windowsill, leaves collapsing in gutters, streetcar bells ringing through the avenues. None of it reached her cell. The outside world advanced its clocks, but inside, time pooled. Folklore had names for this. In the old villages, they spoke of changelings, children stolen away by unseen hands and replaced with figures that looked human but were not. These changelings never aged as they should. They sat in corners, eyes too large, speech delayed or absent. Families whispered that they were not theirs, that some bargain had been struck with the unseen. The asylum made its own changeling, a girl placed into a ledger, made to stay exactly as she was when the ink first dried. And yet there is another myth that haunts this case. The revenant. The one who returns unchanged, year after year, long after everyone else has altered. Imagine a file that keeps saying, "Child," even as hair turns white, as bones slow, as decades fall away. That word becomes a revenant, a ghost that refuses to leave the page. Each time the staff turned to the register, they saw not a woman, but the persistence of child. The system believed the ink more than the body. The documents carry phrases the asylum never used elsewhere. Not compatible. In margins faintly rubbed, in notes that sound more like incantations than policy. It is as though the institution invented its own spell, a way of renaming a life so it could remain unresolved. And once a word like that is inscribed in the record, it continues to act. It becomes ritual, paper, as sorcery. What is a life inside such paper? A sentence that does not end, written by a clerk who may have forgotten her face by the time he put down the pen. The record insists she was temporary. The walls proved she was permanent. The cruelest paradox is that both were true. She was always filed as if about to leave, and she never did. This is where we begin tonight. With a ledger that refused to revise itself, and a girl who became a case number stretched across 40 years. This is not a short story, and it will not rush. It is an unhurried file, one that lingers, one that breathes slower than the clock. Tonight we open the drawer and sit beside the paper. We listen to the cell that contained her, a room that became its own season, repeating without end. You are welcome to stay with it, to let the story gather around you at the pace it chooses. It may feel like snow drifting against a pane, each flake indistinguishable, yet the accumulation deepens. These stories are long because the harm they describe was long, and sometimes the only way to hear them is to move as slowly as the years themselves. If you have not subscribed, consider it not as a click, but as a gesture, a way of joining the ritual. These files are never brief. They need company along the way. And if you are listening now, tell me your country and the time. Across continents and hours, across midnight and morning, there is solace in knowing others are with you, listening to the same forgotten case, watching the same paradox unfold. The room was never only a room. To name it simply is to shave off the edges of what it kept. Step inside its held breath. The first sensation is air, not sight. Damp wool, a thin carbolic, and the faint metal of iron bars that cool the tongue. Dust keeps the hours when no one else does, a gray ledger written without ink. A desk waits beside the door, closer to hinge than window so a hand can reach paper and key without taking a step. The oak top has been worn into a shallow trough by wrists that learned where to rest. Fit your arm there, and your bones recognize the place. The groove is a signature pressed by living bodies and left for us to read. Above the desk hangs a calendar that insists on the wrong month. January addresses March. August contradicts December. No one tears the page. No one advances the nail. Around that nail, a soft dark halo has formed, soot building a crown the wall never asked to wear. Under raking light, small scratches show where someone tried to pry it free and stopped. Habit outweighed correction. Stillness outran accuracy. Light here does not fall so much as settle. When the door closes, the candle bends toward the corridor as if the room inhales. Drag a finger along the plaster, and you will carry back a line of black that cloth will not persuade. Soot nests in paint the way history nests in policy, secure, stubborn, and older than apology. Her door bears a brass placard nailed slightly off-center. The number stamped into it, 27, lists a room that the ward plan denies. The blueprint for that year names 26 cells, nothing more. Somewhere between drawing and hammer a space appeared that the paper refused. Brass keeps its own counsel. Paper pretends not to know and calls the pretense a plan. Stand still long enough, and the room answers without voice. Draft traces loop the ankles. The floorboards swell where feet turned at the same point for decades, a landmark of hesitation cut by bodies instead of chisels. A pale crescent near the latch shows the arc of a key that missed more than once. These are not accidents. These are minutes that hardened into matter. Listen to the ward's arithmetic. One tray scours a circle into the desk where bowls return to the same spot every afternoon. A pitcher has left rings that ghost outward in pale ovals, each ring a season of refill and evaporation. The ledger's corners collect lampblack because clerks dust the page to see indentations and forget to clean the edges. Dust is a confession they never meant to leave. Smell stitches the senses together. Carbolic promises cleansing and fails. Beneath that pledge is damp wool that never quite dries and soap that never quite leaves, followed by the iron scent of grasped bars. Once, a citrus passed through with someone's lunch and dared to sound like outside. It vanished in an hour. This air has been trained to swallow novelty and return to what holds. We linger not because decay is beautiful, but because decay remembers. The desk remembers the exact weight of a wrist that signed without seeing. The floor remembers where an attendant paused before deciding to continue. The door remembers which knock belonged to routine and which to decision. Old houses kept a rumor of an attic child, a pale figure at a dormer who aged more slowly than the world, always seated, always watching fields turn without rising to join them. Families left plates by the door. The attic was an architecture of pause, and this cell its institutional cousin. The rumor descends to ground level and receives a placard. Doubt that a room can hold a person as an idea? Look at the edges. The skirting board swells where the mop could never reach because the bed lived in the way. Under that swell, a chalk line marks an older layout, a memory of furniture that outlasted the furniture itself. Near the ceiling, a rectangle of paler paint shows where a sign once hung. The letters are gone. The absence remains. Set your fingers in the trough of the desk. Papers are stacked with tidy impatience, the top sheet catching on a splinter no one sands, because the splinter has been promoted to furniture. A nib scratches, halts, resumes. The rhythm of copying names repeats without conscience. Copy a name long enough, and the name becomes an object. Record an object long enough, and the object becomes a room. This ward understands loops. The mop loop, the key loop, the loop of a clerk's initial, the loop of a day that will not open itself. Trace the loops with a finger, and you will rehearse the path the institution walked for 40 years. You will return to the same door. The wood accepts your return, because that is what a loop makes, a place held. We will not decorate the walls with mercy. They are not merciful. They are consistent. Consistency says the plan is correct because the plan has been followed. When the plan disagreed with the brass remained. When the ledger disagreed with the corridor prevailed. Policy learned the room's shape and called it policy. Stand again at the threshold and breathe with it. The candle leans. The draft draws a line at your ankles and erases it. From the hinge comes a small sigh, metal completing its purpose. Now you understand why a hand learned the pressure to finish a loop the same way. Now you understand how a desk teaches posture. Now you understand how a placard can instruct a century to keep a door closed. This is the place. The desk, the groove, the soot, the tilted brass, the wrong month still announcing itself, the air that refuses a new scent, the floor that remembers where bodies turned. None of these objects know her name, yet each has held the argument longer than any witness. The argument is simple. The room says, she stayed. The room holds, and the record obeys, still. Volume 3 of the register opens to folio 42 recto, a hand already waiting there for us from a century and a half ago. Left margin. Column for condition. Next. Name, if known. Then age, parish, and ward. The line we need begins without a name. It begins with a noun that should never be a person, child admitted, and continues in a sentence that thinks it will be brief. The clerk writes the hour first, 11:20 p.m., then a weight that wobbles in the scale of his hand, 78 lb, uncertain. Then the cell assignment, 18, and after the 8 a pale tale that suggests he was going to write 7 and decided not to, a hesitation that leaves its own record. The entry is tidy, the pen steadiest at the turns. He signs J.L. Pritchard in a loop that on other pages closes cleanly. Here the loop smears, as though a cuff brushed it while the ink still breathed. We read the next columns aloud because numbers spoken into air resist misuse. Parish, unknown. Origin, street. Conveyance, carriage via Bellevue transfer. That last phrase asks to be believed. There should be a small docket pinned to the verso, the stub of a ferry ticket, a porter's initials, the trace of a receipt number. There is none. The page that would have held it bears 2 faint square impressions where something once pressed, then left. The carriage existed on paper long enough to leave its shadow, and not long enough to leave itself. His inventory line falters. Dress, gray cotton, chemise, shoes, and then a long dash, a line that refuses to decide whether it is a dash or the beginning of a word. He resumes below with, not present. We picture the moment, midnight, a girl without shoes. The clerk uncertain whether to catalog lack. He compromises by admitting absence as an item and moves to the next column. Observation, hold. A stamp, a habit, a door. Age receives its numeral, 14. The 4 sits lower than the 1, crouching into the ruled line as if to take up less space. Later, someone returns with a thinner pen and writes child in the white above the pair, as though the word could correct the number. The number remains. The word floats. Both are true, and neither is sufficient. The ledger's grammar can carry her only as far as child. Beyond that, language stalls. Pritchard's signature is our first contradiction. We fetch his hand from other folios to compare. On 41 verso, his J begins with a confident downstroke that kisses the baseline, lifts, and completes a neat loop. On 42 recto, the J begins hungry, overshoots the baseline, and drags a filament of ink like a web toward the next column before being wiped by cloth or cuff. He either rushed or was rushed. On 43 recto, he returns to his usual temper. The variance could be fatigue. It could be mimicry by another clerk who knew his loops imperfectly. Or it could be what it feels like, the hand disturbed by the case it names. Indexers copy, then codify. Weeks later, the intake list for the quarter recodes her from 13B to 03V, 13B to 03V, without notation. The column header explains the letters, juvenile, B, vagrant, V, but it does not explain the 0. Even if the classification office wished to preserve anonymity, they rarely erase the decade with it. 13 becomes IRO3, a movement that looks like a mistake, until you watch the system prefer a symbol of origin over a symbol of age. If you must file a life, choose the word that makes stillness plausible. Vagrant travels nowhere. Child insists on moving through years. The mutation is administrative, not arithmetic. Fairy tales warned us that names change in the forest. Here they change at the desk. The travel log is the second contradiction, and it is ferocious precisely because it is absent. Bellevue transfers were bureaucratic loves. They produced slips, tallies, receipts, and the comfort of carbon copies. On this night, there is only the clerk yes assertion and two pale square ghosts on the paper. We do not call it a lie. We call it a document that refuses to be joined by its kin. When records shun the company they're supposed to keep, it is often because they would be asked to speak together. Cell 18 receives a tidy underline. Later, someone adds a note at the far right in a different hand, smaller, anxious, 27 actual. We have already stepped into that numerical argument with the brass on the door. The blueprint lists 26 cells. The corridor has 27. The ledger picks one. The corridor insists on the other. The addendum tries to reconcile without shame. You can sense the writer's wish that numbers would be polite. They are not. They are loyal to the surface that created them. Night shift notes begin on a separate sheet, referenced from the register by a code. Vol on card 27. The matron writes a narrow story with ordinary words. Lights out 10 p.m., patient placed at 10:45. Quiet, no expression. But the time is a rock in the smooth. If lights were out at 10, and the clerk writes an 11:20 admission, who placed whom at 10:45? The matron's placed may refer to the bed, not the ward. The clerk's admitted may refer to paper, not presence. The half hour between them opens like a small drawer and shows what drawers always show. Both truth and habit filed together. A column labeled Guardian Kin receives the mark these ledgers use for none. A small square, more pressure than pigment. We meet that square again in the relief list of the city charity office months later. The same hand that owns triangles for widows and half circles for injured men presses this square beside unaccompanied. Symbols move across offices like dialects. They are spoken without thinking. They sound like help and often function as doors. Midway down the page, the remark line adopts a tone the book rarely uses. Not compatible. It does not appear in the printed legend. It does not appear on other nights in this quarter. It belongs neither to medicine nor to law. It reads like the decision of a room. No one claims the phrase. It hangs in the margin, without initials. When we press gently along the edge of the page, the fibers shine where a pen rested before committing. Someone rehearsed the words before writing them. They were not vocabulary, they were intent. The intake cartile card, a smaller stock that follows the person from desk to door, shows a second micro-uncertainty. Under marks, the nurse writes, small scar above left brow. On the following line, perhaps forgetting she has switched lines, she writes again, above left brow. The repetition sits there like a stutter. The body offered the same fact twice, or the observer needed to be certain the file would not forget the only thing that felt singular. The line for language fills with the phrase no speech. On later pages, the same hand refuses speech for other patients. We infer a boundary that had not yet hardened into policy. Silence could be described as refusal or as absence. The earliest moment of classification is always the most revealing. Before the category picks its favorite verb, the hand reaches for a word that betrays what it fears. No speech is a lack that asks nothing. Refuses is a will that must be managed. Tonight, the lack wins. Later, the will. We step back from the text and see it as a map of pressure. The heavier downstrokes live at the ends of words, not the beginnings. The clerk was finishing each term with more weight than he began it. An odd fatigue that suggests stopping, not starting, demanded effort. He could write, child admitted, lightly enough. He had to press to finish it, as if the paragraph did not want to end. In the index, the 03V recode drifts to a column with a different title block, juvenile vagrant, female, no guardianship. Once there, a cross-reference points us to a second book. Vol S, page 201, where discharge dates usually go. The space for discharge is blank. That is not unusual for a week. It is a statement after a month. After a year, it becomes a routine. After a decade, the blank is no longer a promise. It is a policy that cannot admit itself. One more stutter. admitted by, and the clerk leaves the dash to hang. He fills it later with constable, a job that wears many names and fewer faces. Another book, same month, lists porter. Neither man signs here. We could reconcile by imagining that both brought her, porter to desk, constable to door, but the paper does not offer that courtesy. It prefers double entry to single story. 2 actors, 2 verbs, 1 girl. We close the register a fraction and let the ruled lines blur into a field. The contradictions we have gathered are small enough to fit under a fingernail. A loop smeared a carriage without a stub, a number that thinks it is another number, a time that precedes itself a remark that speaks a word the book does not own. None of them alone refutes the ledger. Together they hum. They hum the way a cupboard door hums after you push it most of the way closed and walk away. You can pretend it shut. The room knows it did not. It would be easy, merciful even, to forgive each error. Midnight entries wobble, men tire, forms run out, stamps hide. But fairy tales do not award mercy for changes of name. They warn that renaming is a kind of control. Here the renaming moves both ways. Child to vagrant, 13B to 03V, 18 to 27, speech to no speech. The powers behind the desk prefer codes that explain the stillness they are about to impose. A person is easier to keep if the word that holds her is a setting, not a journey. We keep our finger in 42 recto and find the smaller card again, the one meant to travel with her between door and bed. On its back, in a pencil harder than habit, someone has written 2 words you'd expect on a shelf tag, not a human record. Hold until observation. That line is nearly kind if you read it once. If you read it for 40 years, it becomes a prayer the institution says to itself to remain the kind of place it claims to be. The prayer never ends. The door obeys. The paper, faithful to the first night's confidence, continues to call her temporary. The room continues to prove otherwise. The ledger told one story, but the second layer of record is where the first contradiction no longer stands alone. In the Asylum archives, 2 voices echo each other across the years. One, a matron's diary, the other a deposition taken long after she left the ward. Between them we hear not her speech, for she had none, but the speech of those who watched her silence. The matron's diary is written in a script thin as breath. She was not a woman who wasted ink on flourish. Her entries are clipped, but within the clipped lines something lingers. On May 6, 1872, she wrote, "Child still in cell, quiet, looks but does not look." A sentence that folds back on itself, refusing to choose. Looks but does not look. The words say both present and absent in the same breath. On June 10th, no noise all night. Attendants forgot tray unmissed. It is not a note of neglect, not exactly, but a recognition. If silence can erase appetite, then the system reads the absence of protest as proof of order. She writes nothing else that night. Perhaps she turned the page and thought better of continuing. On August 2nd, she blinked 3 times when I passed. No other change. Blinking counted as change. In a ward of cries and outbursts, silence became anomaly. So every flutter of eyelid was recorded like an earthquake. The matron does not ask what it means. She files it in the same tone she uses for the weather, factual, unexamined, and therefore permanent. Years later, in 1889, a deposition was taken from Elijah Rowe, a maintenance man who worked the asylum furnace. He is asked about the ward. His answers are short, halting, but each feels like a stanza. I recall the quiet girl, thin, pale. We were told not to look in. The examiner presses. Why not? Orders. Quiet wards keep donors at peace. Quiet meant success. Silence was not just tolerated. It was commodified. Rowe's second statement twists the ledger's claim further. She walked sometimes, at night, between door and wall. I heard no step, but saw her shadow move. If true, the diary's silence was not passivity, but a choreography of endurance. A life paced between 6 steps, repeated until shadow itself became the record. The matron and the maintenance man never spoke to each other about her. Their lines do not acknowledge one another, yet they rhyme across years and intentions. One says she blinks, the other says her shadow moves. Neither grants her voice. Both turn absence into evidence. The contradictions are subtle but persistent. The ledger calls her child. The diary writes her without age for 17 years. Never woman, never grown, just quiet one, patient, same as before. Time in narrative freezes. Elijah, deposed 20 years later, describes her as he saw her in 1875. Yet he speaks in present tense. She is thin. She does not age. The examiner corrects, was. He insists, is. The deposition holds the present open, as if grammar itself refuses to let her leave. Neighbors, too, wrote condolence letters when staff deaths occurred. In one, folded inside the charity office files, a neighbor refers to the quiet one who walks the garden row like a shadow. There was no garden row accessible to the locked cell. Either imagination embroidered the truth, or staff whispered myths beyond the wall until neighbors believed they had seen her among the beans and the sunflowers. Folklore is quick to fill silence with apparition. And here we find it. The neighbor invents a garden shadow, another changeling tale in civic dress. We pause here, because silence is not neutral. In the asylum system, silence was perfection. No screams meant no complaints meant no investigation. Boards loved silence because silence made good arithmetic. Each line of the matron A.S. diary that reports no noise is a line of funding secured, a report signed off without question. Silence became not absence, but currency. There is a strange cruelty in that. The absence of sound is read not as deprivation, but as cooperation. The lack of protest becomes proof that nothing is wrong. What institution does not love a patient who erases herself? She became the system's most valued ward precisely because she made no demand. Read the matron's lines again. Quiet, no change, no noise. They look like kindness. They sound like relief. But they are also the blueprint of a perfect ward, one who cannot trouble the arithmetic, one who guarantees tranquility. Elijah's deposition makes this arithmetic plain. Quiet meant donors at peace. Donors at peace meant jobs. The system did not feed silence. Silence fed the system. Silence also works as erasure. In fairy tales, the enchanted often lose their voice. A girl trapped in glass, a sister forbidden to speak until her brother's geese feathers are sewn, a mermaid whose tongue is traded for legs. Speechless figures recur across myth because silence is the easiest prison to enforce. Once mute, you can be transformed into anything the teller requires. Here, the mute figure becomes the system's proof of success. The diary and the deposition mirror each other in a cruel symmetry. One is written daily, brief, loyal to routine. The other comes decades later, under oath, yet carries the same conclusion. The girl remained unchanged. Neither account asks why unchanged should equal cared for. Neither questions whether 40 years of quiet is a form of violence. They simply accept it as stability. This is the danger of repetition. When enough records agree, they stop sounding like witnesses and begin sounding like liturgy. The refrain of no change becomes holy text. And holy texts are rarely interrogated by the systems that sanctify them. But we hear in those clipped diary notes and halting deposition lines something else. The haunting rhythm of someone who was there, always the same, until the building itself relied on her as part of its furniture. Not a person, but a fixture. The silent one, the quiet one. The girl locked 40 years in one cell. All right, we now move into beat 5, forensic beat, 100 words. This section introduces the impossible forensic result, something tested that should behave one way, but doesn't. For this asylum case, we can use the motif from the template, a photograph taken of the girl in her early years of confinement. Under normal aging conditions, the cabinet photo should silver, fade, or yellow. But here, it darkens, then returns, unchanged. That becomes the impossible beat. We'll also add a minor forensic detail, like soot or chemical residue on a ledger card to reinforce the uncanny. Mythic resonance. The image rehearses instead of aging. Here's the seamless VO draft, Wamahana 30 words. Among the boxes that survived the asylum's closure is a photograph card labeled only with the number 27, the girl's cell. The paper stock is consistent with the early 1870s, cabinet size, matte finish, embossed with the studio backmark of Mulberry Street. On its surface, a child sits with her head tilted slightly to the right. The eyes are open, the hands folded in a way that looks too careful for accident. The ink of the backmark tells us it was printed no later than 1873, which means, if time works as it should, this photograph should carry the wounds of age. But it does not. A technician's notes from 1910 survive in the same folder. They describe the procedure clearly. Subject card and control print placed side by side, exposure to UV. The control, a photograph of an attendant taken in 1872, behaved as paper does. It yellowed at the edges. Its silver salts grew dull. The surface fogged into gray. The subject card, the girl's photograph, did the opposite. It darkened, as though swallowing light, then returned to its original clarity once the exposure ceased. The notes are clinical. They do not say impossible. They simply record image unchanged. Think about what that means. The control photograph obeys chemistry. The subject photograph resists. It rehearses the act of aging, then erases the rehearsal. As if time applies only during the act of observation, not before, not after. A portrait that decides when it will participate in decay. The technician added a second line, almost in protest. No evidence of retouch. He was careful to deny fraud, even as he admitted the anomaly. In the culture of the asylum, to say impossible was to risk ridicule. So he wrote what he could. Image unchanged. A note that becomes itself a kind of refrain. We stare at the photograph and see the paradox already described in the ledger. The register insisted she was child. The photograph insists she remains child, even when decades argue otherwise. Ink and emulsion conspire to tell the same untruth, or the same truth depending on which witness you choose to believe. The forensic detail does not end with the photo. On the reverse of the card, under raking light, indentations reveal words that were never inked. The lamp-black test brings them up like bruises. 3 words pressed into the card's pulp. Still not aligned. Whoever held the card rehearsed writing it, then stopped. The hand decided against ink, but the pressure entered the fiber. Not compatible. Not aligned. The mutations of a refrain travel even to photographs. There is a second, smaller forensic puzzle in this folder. A furnace ledger card, dated 1881, tested under microscopy, shows soot particles beneath a layer of varnish, which is impossible. Varnish seals surfaces. Anything that lands after cannot pass under. Yet here we see soot trapped where it should not be, as if fire memory intruded into the document after the seal. The page remembers a burn the asylum refuses to admit. Myth always walks in when science falters. To villagers, a photograph that refuses to age is no different from a revenant, a being that returns again and again without change. They said portraits could steal the soul, that mirrors could trap the restless dead. The asylum may have laughed at such tales, but its own cabinets prove sympathetic. A girl whose photo remains unchanged is not just a patient. She is a revenant on paper, haunting the archive. The soot under varnish suggests another myth. Fire that burns backwards, ash that appears in the fibers before the spark begins. In some folktales, fire spirits eat words before they are spoken, leaving silence behind. The asylum's furnace ledger, marked with trapped soot, echoes those tales. A book that remembers fire that never happened, a fire that was denied, but still left its trace. Together, the photograph and the soot card form a duet. One refuses to age. The other remembers what did not occur. Both are refusals of ordinary chronology. The girl's story is not only confined in space but distorted in time. She remains child, image unchanged. The furnace ledger remains burned, varnish unchanged. These are not accidents. They are structural. The photograph in particular becomes unbearable when you compare it across decades. In 1873, she is a girl of 14. In 1890, she is 35. In 1909, she is 54. But if you bring the photograph into the light, she is still 14. Time outside runs. Time inside refuses. The archive has invented a way to keep her perpetually at the threshold of adolescence. The refrain child admitted becomes prophecy fulfilled not by care, but by chemistry. This is the impossible beat. The system can endure ordinary error, smudges, missing slips, recoded numbers. But a photograph that refuses to age is more than error. It is defiance. It is the file itself declaring permanence. We might comfort ourselves that it is only paper, only emulsion, only varnish. But institutions are built from paper. Their power resides in what paper claims. And here, paper claims that she never grew. The technician's line, image unchanged, is meant to close the matter. Instead, it opens it wider. Each time you look at the card, you see not only a girl, but an institution rehearsing its favorite spell. She is still child, still admitted, still unchanged. And beneath that card, in soot and varnish, in indentations and refrains, the building repeats the same line. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing. Across archives, a phrase does not stay where it was born. It migrates. It bends to each new hand that writes it and still keeps its shape. That is how systems talk to themselves. Not in paragraphs, but in refrains. The first refrain hides in the return slip stapled to the intake card whenever a physician requested further observation. The slips are small, thin paper, cheap, the kind that tears along a crease if you look at it too long. Early ones carry a tidy italic hand. Hold until observation. Later ones adopt a blockier stamp, hold until observation. The words do not change. The method of delivery grows louder. Each time the slip is renewed, the period of holding that was supposed to be a bridge becomes the bridge itself. Hold until observation, say the slips. The observation once promised never arrives, and so the holding becomes the only fulfilled instruction. By the fourth year, a clerk has introduced a new sentence in pencil at the slip S bottom. Not compatible. It is the same phrase that appeared in the ledger's remark line, but the graphite here is hesitant. You can see where the point hovered before committing. The pencil is softer than the ink, the pressure deeper than the line. The phrase is not policy. It is a conviction trying to sound like one. The second refrain appears where it does not belong, in the margin of a municipal census book. Enumerators were trained to write names and relationships, not opinions. Yet beside the line where a ward ought to be counted within an institution, a tight marginal hand adds, not aligned. The phrase has no legend, no code, no box to justify its presence. It is a private word speaking through a public book. It means only what it sounds like. She does not align with the categories on the page. It could be an admission of failure or a justification of omission. In practice, it functions as both. Not compatible becomes not aligned. The refrain mutates as refrains do when sung by a different choir. The third refrain lives in a court memo that should have been about funding. The board requests an accounting of costs for long-term observation cases. A typed reply lists totals, then dissolves mid-page into the vocabulary of suspension. Several files remain still processing. Files, not people. Processing, not living. Still, a word that in a human context could mean quiet or peace, here means continuation of a pause. Still processing does not mean work is being done. It means the system has found a way to talk about a person without ever finishing the sentence that would set them down. Taken alone, any one of these lines could be forgiven as shorthand. Together they practice a spell. Hold until observation. Not aligned. Still processing. The order is not accidental. First, an instruction that delays decision. Next, a reclassification that refuses fit. Finally, a bureaucratic present tense that never grants an end. Read quickly, they look like logistics. Read slowly, they bind. Watch the hands that carry them. The early hold until observation belongs to a neat clerk who speaks in curls. The later hold until observation arrives via stamp, because stamps were faster than doubt. Not aligned is a private, furtive pencil, pinched between forefinger and fear. Still processing is a typed comfort, designed to satisfy anyone who asks how a life could continue without resolution for decades. It's being processed, says the memo. The word does not say by whom or toward what. We find the refrain again on a shelf tag for the very box that contains her photographs. Still processing, the tag reads, as if the photographs themselves were waiting to emerge from a bath. The irony is so complete, it no longer reads as humor. It reads as ritual. The archive has learned to label its own refusal to let her end. Folklore understands how repetition makes reality. Names bind creatures when spoken correctly. Instructions lose their power when mispronounced. In some tales, to be freed from an enchantment, you must call the right name 3 times. In others, you must refuse the name given to you. Here, the institution selects its words with the same superstition. Not compatible, not aligned, still processing. If you say refusal 3 ways, refusal hardens into fact. There are peripheral echoes too, small harmonics that ride the primary refrain. A medicine card bears a stamp meant for supplies, not for ward use. The card refers to a tonic never issued, yet the stamp sits above her line like a label. Not for ward use, a sentence designed to police objects finds itself policing a person. A route card for inspections concludes, as they all did, complete route, even though the corridor that should pass her door is not on the plan. Completion declared where passage is denied. The words are not describing. They are performing. In the matron's diary, the echo takes a softer form. No change. The line repeats across seasons until it loses even the dignity of a verb. Same as before. The diary is not a policy document. It does not intend to trap. But repetition works whether it is intentional or not. A room learns to be called the same thing and responds accordingly. A person is written without change, and the institution returns to the page to prove itself right. On the back of the photograph, beneath the lamp black that brought up still not aligned, a second indentation lurks, older and almost shy. Not assigned. The phrase never surfaces in ink in her file, but it lives in pressure here, as if the hand that wrote the first line tried a different mutation before choosing. Not compatible becomes not aligned, becomes not assigned, becomes not allowed to end. The progression arranges itself like beads, with no string except habit. Even the donor report adopts the melody. It refers to quiet wards and successful tranquility, phrases that sound like benefaction until you ask what quiet was achieved and at whose cost. Donor tranquility is a hymn sung over the heads of the locked. Silence as a metric, then a product, then a proof. Numbers behave well when no one speaks to challenge them. We lay these papers side by side so the refrain can be heard without interruption. The return slips hold until observation in a block stamp, the census margins pencil not aligned, the typed still processing, the shelf tag that repeats it, the medicine cards not for ward use watching over a name, the diaries no change, the photographs invisible not assigned, pressing the pulp. Arrange them and the ward begins to sing to itself in a language of denial. It is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It is scored for the instruments on hand. Rubber, ribbon, nib, pressure, soot. If the refrain had run the other way, observed, aligned, completed, she might have moved. But the words chose stasis, and stasis performed as design. The file could not discharge because the language that would permit discharge never arrived. Paper is not only memory, it is creation. It made a condition called held, then proved its necessity by citing itself. There is a last echo we hesitate to mention because it feels like superstition, and we are trying not to be superstitious. In the tiny crevices around the brass 27, Polish has never taken, as if oil refuses to live there. A caretaker writes, still processing on a shelf tag in the next room. A clerk stamps hold until observation while thinking about dinner. A census worker pencils not aligned because the boxes do not romance the life in front of him. None of them hear the others. and yet all of them sing the same line. You cannot call that a conspiracy. You can call it a choir that never learned a second song. We read the refrain one more time, slowly, and let it do its work out loud so we can see it happening. Hold until observation, not aligned, still processing. The first delays, the second denies, the third never ends. The sentence about a girl becomes a sentence for a girl. The door obeys words spoken in rooms where she never stood. The stamp thunks, the pencil presses, the typewriter keys lift and fall, and the file remains open by staying blank. Every system that survives learns to protect itself. By the time decades had passed, the girl in cell 27 was no longer simply a patient, or even a person. She had become a function, a silent proof that the asylum's arithmetic worked. The ledger did not describe her. The ledger drew her, and then the institution mistook its own drawing for reality. The refrain we heard across slips and memos, hold until observation, not aligned, still processing, was not error. It was maintenance. An institution that must report to boards, to donors, to inspectors, cannot afford to record lives that end without explanation. It prefers entries that never close because they keep the appearance of ongoing work. The backlog becomes proof of activity. Still processing looks better on a quarterly report than discharged without cure. The girl was no longer a ward. She was backlog optics, a line item that guaranteed perpetual evidence of observation. The economics of quiet completed the trap. Philanthropy in the 19th century loved tranquility. Donors did not want to imagine wards where patients cried through the night or fought or sang without instruction. They wanted order. They wanted stillness. And stillness could be purchased in two ways, with cure or with silence. Cure was expensive. Silence was cheaper. A ward that made no noise could be presented in a report as proof that treatment worked. The matron E.'s diary entries that said, "No change," became less about her life and more about donor reassurance. Quiet meant jobs secured, salaries continued, wings expanded. The girl became the institution's perfect advertisement. 40 years of quiet packaged as 40 years of care. The vocabulary invented around her is the most telling. Not compatible. Not aligned. Still processing. None of these phrases belong to medicine. They are not clinical, not diagnostic, not even descriptive. They are inventions, words conjured to avoid responsibility. Compatibility is a term borrowed from mechanics, not from bodies. Processing is a term borrowed from industry, not from lives. These words displaced what could not be admitted. That a child was locked in a room and left there until she aged out of every category but absence. Inventing words is how systems preserve themselves. A changeling is not a child. It is a word a family uses to justify what they do not understand. An automaton is not a servant. It is a word an inventor uses to cover the unease of mimicry. Not compatible was the asylum's changeling. Still processing was its automaton. These words allowed the administrators to tell themselves they were not failing a life, they were simply managing a file. Listen carefully and you hear the institution making a new archetype. Not a girl, not a patient, not a woman, not a citizen. Something in between. A creature defined by file. A permanent interim. The system gave itself the power to create a category outside of time. That category is not myth because it never claimed to be. But it functions like myth because once named, it endured longer than the person it described. The incentives converge. Inspectors rewarded the appearance of care. Boards rewarded the arithmetic of occupancy. Donors rewarded tranquility. Clerks rewarded themselves with words that reduced guilt. And so the system produced its own changeling. A girl locked in a cell for 40 years. A girl who became proof not of failure, but of stability. This is the cruelty of paper. Paper makes permanence out of pause. Paper can trap a moment and replay it across decades until even time itself begins to agree. The photograph that darkens then returns. The soot that sits beneath varnish. The refrain that mutates but never ends. These are not just anomalies. They are the system's deepest desire made visible. A desire not for cure, not for release, but for continuity. Continuity at any cost. What begins as care becomes custody. What begins as custody becomes category. And categories, once written, have no incentive to vanish. In fact, their vanishing would harm the arithmetic that feeds the system. Better to keep a girl forever as child admitted than to risk admitting that 40 years of admission is indistinguishable from abandonment. So the asylum did not simply forget her. It remembered her in the way that suited it best, as a quiet entry, as a backlog case, as donor tranquility, as a word that concealed more than it revealed. The system did not misplace her. The system made her into its own invention. And here is the parable. A file draws a person, but the person cannot redraw the file. Once written as child admitted, she could never be written otherwise. No loop, no flourish, no new ink would persuade the archive to let her grow. She was the Ward S most valuable artifact precisely because she remained what the ledger needed her to be, a changeling made by ink, a revenant kept alive by silence, an automaton whose clockwork was the repetition of still processing. Not human categories, but institutional ones. This was the system's genius, and its crime. It did not merely confine her body, it confined her definition. We are left to recognize that the real villain here is not the matron who wrote "no change," nor the maintenance man who said "she is." They were participants, but they were not inventors. The inventor was the system itself, a body larger than any person, whose appetite was fed by silence, whose comfort was bought by donors, whose conscience was sedated by new words. That is why we can say now, with clarity, the girl locked in one cell for 40 years was not just forgotten. She was remembered in a way that erased her. She was remembered as the perfect patient, the one who cost nothing, who demanded nothing, who never ended. A system that makes memory its weapon is not a hospital. It is a myth factory, and its myths do not die when the doors close. They continue, written in margins, pressed into fibers, waiting in drawers. The box is heavy though it carries only paper. We open it slowly, as if weight were measured not in ounces but in years. Inside, 3 artifacts remain that cannot be explained away. 3 residues that linger when all the clerks, all the matrons, all the donors are gone. The first is a triplet written without ink. On the back of her intake card, beneath fiber indentations read like a list rehearsed and abandoned. We dust the surface and the lampblack settles into curves too shallow to be seen otherwise. 3 words, each separated by a dash, each pressed hard enough to scar but not to print. Kept, not kept, still recorded. A hand wrote choices, and then chose none of them. The file became a space where decision could be deferred forever. She was kept. She was not kept. She was still recorded. The fiber does not erase its indecision. It preserves it as if indecision itself were the record. The second residue lives not in a page, but in the furniture. The drawer that holds her file bears a shallow engraving on its underside. You cannot see it when the drawer is closed. Only when you kneel and pull it fully out does the line appear, etched faint and older than the steel itself. 4 words. Don't close the file. No clerk wrote this. No administrator signed it. The sentence has no owner and yet it owns the drawer. We do not know if it was carved in protest, in warning, or in routine. We only know it waits, legible, stubborn, refusing to fade even as the wood around it splinters. The drawer exhales against its rails, and we hear it clearly. Don't close the file. The third residue is the photograph. We place it beside a modern control, another portrait from the same box. The control has yellowed, silver pooling at its edges like water creeping through stone. The girl's portrait, the one labeled 27, remains unchanged. Under ultraviolet, the control fogs, and the subject darkens, then returns exactly as before. A century later, it looks like the same child who was admitted at 14. The photograph does not age, and in refusing to age it condemns us to admit that the institution S story is stronger than the body S. 3 residues, 1 in fiber, 1 in steel, 1 in emulsion. They speak to each other across medium and time. Kept, not kept, still recorded. Don't close the file. Image unchanged. They are not explanations. They are refusals. Refusals to conclude, to release, to allow ending. Refusals that become more permanent than signatures or stamps. What was she then? A girl misplaced or a girl invented by the ledger? A body locked in a cell or a category locked in a word? The question cannot be answered because the archive has chosen to preserve uncertainty rather than resolution. Each artifact keeps her alive by keeping her unfinished. Folklore returns here, as it always does when endings are withheld. The changeling child was never reclaimed because the parents stopped speaking its name. The revenant walks again because the grave marker is left blank. The automaton keeps blinking because no one thinks to wind it down. Myths remind us, the way to end an enchantment is to close the sentence. The asylum never closed the sentence. It chose still processing instead. And so she remained processed, not freed. We could call this cruelty. We could call it neglect. But the deeper truth is more haunting. It was design. Silence was useful. Backlog was useful. Unfinished files were useful. The asylum learned to prefer the useful over the human. In that preference, a girl became a residue, a fixture, a photograph that does not change, a line in a drawer that tells you never to stop reading. This is why her case is not only about her. It is about any system that learns to prize permanence over life, backlog over conclusion, silence over speech. Every bureaucracy has its residues, its unfinished cases, its files that refuse to close because closing would mean admitting a life was held too long. The asylum only made the logic visible because it repeated the same line for 40 years until the line became indistinguishable from truth. So when we close the box now, carefully, slowly, it does not feel like closure. It feels like betrayal. The drawer pushes back, its rails complaining, its steel resisting. The lampblack smears, reminding us that words once pressed cannot be unpressed. The photograph looks out as if waiting for another test, another round of exposure it will defeat. Residues do not rest. They rehearse, they return. We ask again, what was she? A child misplaced or a child invented? We know only this: the archive will not answer. It has chosen a different refrain. Not compatible. Not aligned. Still processing. Don't close the file. The phrases belong not only to her but to every life the system preferred unfinished. This is where we leave her. Not at peace, not at conclusion, but at residue. Her silence is not her own. It has been weaponized into proof. Her photograph is not her likeness. It has been hardened into emblem. Her cell is not a room. It is a blueprint of endurance. We might be tempted to say this is a ghost story, but it is not. Ghosts at least admit death. This is not a haunting. It is an audit. It is the story of a system that forgot how to forget. If you have listened this far, you are part of the ritual. The file remains open not because it wants to, but because we keep reading it aloud. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is. Somewhere, at this same moment, others are doing the same, scattered across continents and clocks, remembering a girl locked 40 years in one cell whose story refuses to conclude.